Good morning, Dr. Michael Fisher, urologist, philosopher, educator, and certainly therapist for many years. Going back to officially becoming a therapist, um, working with youth, 13 to 18-year-old boys who've been kicked out of the society, more or less pulled out, kicked out, yanked out, kicking and screaming. And many of them at times, I found when I worked at the program, Quest Ranch in Alberta, that they really didn't want to be in the system. They were glad to be kicked out. But of course, they were ashamed of being kicked out. A shame is the topic for today. Shame is arguably the most difficult of all emotional experiences as a human, and I would say a social organism like humans are, Homo sapien, can experience. You think there's a whole lot of other emotions that would be really horrible, and they are at some level dreadful, including, fear of death, fear of being abandoned, rejected. And shame covers a deep layer within all of those. But shame is got some unique qualities as well that I want to pull out and tell you what I know about shame. And I'm not because I've been just reading books about shame and the psychology of shame or sociology of shame, and the impacts of that. I have read books in the past. I have some on my shelf. I find it's important that I'm also an author because I'm writing a memoir right now. And I thought, well, how do you start a memoir? You want to start with writing about what you know best, which is yourself. And to make a memoir for me interesting and hopefully readers interesting, especially ones who want to read deeply into another's life, their memoir, I'm remembering through a few different keys and prompts that I'm find some by accident, some by planning that trigger me and remind me of really key parts of my memoir, my life, the memories of my life that actually are significant and have an impact. And yes, I can have some of those memories that are fun and playful and sexy and who knows what, joyful. But a core beyond all that is this deep shame-based personality, which I have self-diagnosed. I self-diagnosed that when I started this program. So let me go back to where I'm going to go with that. And then I'm going to read a case study of a young man that I worked with at that time, a teenager, probably 14 years old. I really remember my 14-year-old years. I remember them preciously, the good and the bad and the ugly. But I also want to trace a little bit of why I got into this job, working at Quest Ranch with these young people, and ended up becoming the therapeutic manager for the entire program, did the staff training and development, did the leadership program, family therapy, etc. That was back in 1983, folks. So a long time, 42 years ago or so. I stumbled into that job because I had already was a school teacher, but after 2 years of school teaching, grades 5 to 6, 7 to 8, worked in a small rural school. I was from the big city. I was a very good teacher. That wasn't the issue, but I was also a very controversial teacher and a public controversial figure within that community, that small community in rural Alberta, kind of Bible Belt, conservative, and got in a lot of trouble in various ways. But there's many reasons I knew that teaching was not for me. I had a dream and it said, you really got to get out. Your soul will die here. There will be no turning back if you conform and stay within what that system wants of you as a teacher and as a person. And I could not do that. However, it felt horrible having to quit teaching after 2 years. After this is my second career path, got into education, right? Got the degrees, got married, had children, got a job, sounding pretty normal. That's not like me, really. And I'll tell you a little bits about that. And where my shame based personality comes from is also a rebel based personality. And I think those two go together very, very intimately. Rebel based, shame based. The rebel being the one who says no, the shame based, basically saying, no, I guess I can't belong in that society if I say no. And yet, the shame based has to find a way to live in the world. Or at some point, like one of those boys that I worked with at the ranch, one of the clients, they say to themselves at some point, and maybe it's earlier than 14, but he said it at 14. I'll read his suicide note that he left to the program staff. This was a year after I left that staff. So to trace back to why I got into that job, quit teaching, and I knew I was retiring. I was going to be going full time as a wildlife artist at the time, a realistic painter. And I was winning awards, and I thought, well, I can sell this. I can make prints of these paintings, and I could probably go out and market them, which I did for years, and made enough to make a living to for me, my wife, and my two daughters, but very poor. I mean, when I say making a living, and then I ended up not paying my income tax properly, which is also part of my shame of not being a good businessman and wasn't trained to by my parents. I knew nothing, and I went on to be an entrepreneur selling this art, and I was just taking money in enough to survive and live, right? And yet realized that the block company down the street that I hired to do my income tax every year for the last 8 years, they had not been doing my taxes properly, nor warned me that I am an entrepreneur and I have to self claim as a business and pay taxes for that. And I didn't pay any taxes on all my income. And I ended up with a $15,000 debt back in the late 80s. And I ended up, you know, having to go through an enormous financial crisis, basically, which affected my children, affected me, affected my partner at the time, affected my life. But I got through all that. And what it traces back to is I went into this program rather innocently to work with youth. Okay, so no longer get any teacher salary gone, professional certificate I have, could have gone back to teaching at any time. So I had the ticket. I officially retired in conflict with the authorities there, the school board, the school district. Then someone said, there's a program that for youth out on this Quest Ranch, it's 50 miles out in the west in the forest lands and of where I lived. And I thought that was cool. And they said they needed an artist to come and teach some art classes to their young boys, part of their program. They had a wilderness program, they had a school program, they had um, domestic, raising of horses, taking care of chickens and sheep and all those kinds of things on that ranch as well, so that the boys would get this, rehabilitation in a more holistic way. They did the long wilderness canoe trips. So when I heard about all that and I could go out and teach art, once a week or something like that, I drove out and, did the interview and got the job part-time and went out and started doing art with the class. It's about 7 or 8 boys usually, and that's who was in the program. And they'd be in for 12 months. They're completely pulled out. They would go visit their families now and then. Families could come and visit now and then, but fundamentally they were in a isolated program to get through and hopefully graduate so they could go back to the society, wherever that was, whoever would be their caregivers appropriately, and so on. And that was our job, is to reintegrate them back in a good way. Of course, a very difficult challenge. Officially, they were labeled, diagnosed as behaviorally disordered youth. All right, so I kind of relate to those young black guys for lots of reasons. I wasn't diagnosed that way, but in many ways, I was pretty much a rebel all my life in various ways, and so I could really relate to the rebel in them. Yes, they were behaviorally disordered. not a term I prefer, but they were behaviorally, I guess, what you call discordant. There's actually a diagnosis for disagreeable personality, and there's another label for behaviorally deviant or something like that in the psychiatric literature. So yeah, I could relate to all of it. I just never got into the serious problems they did, and probably because my family more or less remained intact and relatively healthy. These kids didn't have that kind of family background. But when I started teaching the art, I very quickly I was already studying some art therapy, doing some art therapy on myself, going to a few workshops, learning about this fascinating use of art to be part of a vehicle for finding out the deeper layers of self and the art reflecting back to you, things that you couldn't necessarily verbalize. So I love this learning I was doing on art therapy, even though I wasn't in an official training clinically, etc. And I didn't have a clinical counseling background either. I was just in education. But I had been taking for a couple of years some a lot of intense counseling type, peer counseling type programs and understanding theory about how humans are hurt and how they heal and how to counsel with people and peer counseling and grassroots. So I had a lot of good smarts of how to work with these young people. I'd worked with young people growing up a little bit and volunteered, and but I just kind of knew I knew who these kids were more or less. Okay, they're all unique, of course, but they also have some very universal traits. And at one point, as I was the therapeutic director and did the frontline therapy with the boys and with their families at times, I was starting to read a lot on therapy and young people, right? And various pathologies, from narcissism disorder to borderline personality disorder to schizophrenia. And I was just getting my own education. I had a bit of a supervisor, but not fully a psychologist supervisor. My director was also a supervisor. He also had these really sort of street smarts. He was an ex-principal. He really knew how to work with youth, and especially the rebellious youth who used to have to come in his office. And he was good. He knew how to work a certain kind of way with them. But he was sort of the tough sergeant guy, the soft velvet glove, and I was much more the magician, strange, weird artist guy that worked with the youth. So the combination of us, the authoritarian, and me carrying another power, what I call more in the magical, artistic, creative realm. Both of us had an ability when we worked together, especially with the youth and their families, to really be useful. Like we had a lot of success relatively to other programs. But we were small, right? Very small, very close family knit kind of feel in the facility. And I just realized, and the director realizes that, Michael, you really ought to be, doing the main therapy with these kids, or we're going to fire our psychologist who are paying unbelievable price for. He just comes out here and he does stuff, and he's into behaviorism, a little bit of cognitive behavioral, and the whole thing just didn't fit with the kids. The kids were so rebellious to those kinds of therapies, and for the most part, very few could benefit from them. So I came in doing the wild stuff. I'll just call it that. Let's not go into the details. Get back to the shame base. Doing the reading on various disorders, having a few years now under my belt of working with kids there at the program. And all of a sudden, I'm reading this book on shame-based personality. Can't remember who it was written by. And I'm going tick, 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 tick. This really fits a lot of these kids I was working with. And then I went, that really fits for me too. So aha moment of insight that, oh, therapist has the same disorder problems as the children he's working with, the youth. Um, yeah, sure, I manage it better. Yeah, I'm more educated. Yeah, I'm older. Yeah, I've practiced how to mask that shame-based personality. So masking is something a lot of people are talking about in psychology right now, in the clinical world, etc., of how people have certain like neurodivergency or they have homosexual tendencies or interests and or whatever kinds of differences than the norm, they learn how to normie themselves. I learned how to normie myself as a rebel, as someone who had this really sensitive, shame-based personality, very vulnerable, but I learned how to be tough, right? So that's a type of masking, toughness, a little bit of perhaps bravado, maybe. I wasn't super bravado, but yeah, I had some of that. And as a male, you kind of, especially for working class as I am, background, you have to kind of toughen yourself up or you're going to really get bullied and beaten. So you had to kind of fake it till you make it. And luckily enough, I made it through, and yeah, I did get some education, but I was still pretty much in, kind of the lower end of the higher education world. At that time in the 80s, reading this, getting this insight of a shame-based personality, and I began to realize, yeah, alcoholic family background on both sides, um, and or a religious fundamental on my dad's side. And to me, I just seemed like everything they were doing to God was because they felt ashamed of who they were. That's sort of how the Bible predicts you and shows you a human being is basically supposed to be in shame, and that's their sin. Going back to Eve and Adam in the story. So I wasn't buying into all that, but I'm just saying that it's pretty pervasive in our society here in the Western world where I live, in so-called developed country, Christian country, more or less. And even though I was very secular, I could see all these impacts of this kind of cosmology of shame. That's how we start. We start in sin, and then maybe you'll get better. Well, working with the boys, when I began to realize is they're also in shame because they've been kicked out of the society, right? They've been discarded, even though, yeah, they may still be loved and people are waiting for them to come back repaired. And this is kind of like the same story, isn't it? The authorities, God, the authorities, the school, parents, police force, whoever, social worker, basically says this kid has to go into a program because they're not acceptable to live in the normal world or the better world of so-called good humans, adults, and so on. The reference point for normal. Well, kind of same with God, right? Like you're not allowed to live in heaven because you're fallen, and therefore, you might deserve if you do the good work, repair yourself, kind of the rehabilitation of the species. That's how that religion, particularly the Abrahamic religions, tend to look at human condition, human nature, and human potential. It's like you're in shame, like you should be in shame, and you should be fearing God and or fearing the authority so you don't break the law. So a lot of our boys, yes, they were all lawbreakers. That included a main reason why they got kicked out of the system, but there's lots of other acting out, so-called rebelliousness, deviancy, and sometimes, they cause some real damage, serious damage to property for sure, and sometimes to other humans. And of course, that all gets them in the criminal system. That's when we get them and are supposed to do some kind of therapeutic rehabilitation with them. I'm just showing that the whole cycle of that, and my logic was when I read that book on shame-based personality, I said, there's no real motivation for these kids to repair themselves, to really rehabilitate in our program or any program they would have taken. There's no real reason to do it other than they're doing it because they feel guilty. At and below guilty is shame. They feel shamed. They have been shamed and they are guilty. The law gave them an offense, a criminal offense on their record. I won't go into the fine details of guilt and shame in this talk. If you want me to do more on that, I can. But let's just say guilty is a part of the shaming process. And if the shaming goes deeper and deeper for various reasons, then a person feels not just guilty, they feel there's something wrong with them, that they will, in fact, never be good enough. And in a way, that's not a motivation because to be motivated from never feeling good about yourself, if I do the right behaviors, then they will accept me and I can go back and, have a bit of fun and not have to live in this ranch program, which is really a drag because there's so many rules and regulations. I have to live with about 8 other kids, 7 other kids, my peer group, who are also driving me nuts because they all have this behavioral disorder personality, but they're so stuck. And I knew it. I could feel that psychologically. I couldn't just go into, oh, we're going to repair them and, make them good citizens again. I don't operate, I don't even think like that. And again, that's my rebellious, my own shame-based personality for lots of different reasons. And abuse in my background as well, abuse in their background as well. May have come from the family, may have come from other members in society, but they were severely hurt and damaged and shamed. Some bullied systematically. And then they act out, right? Of course. But all of it just breeds more shame. And so, even for them, at some level, I understand that this is a hard piece to get. For them to actually repair themselves, rehabilitate themselves, and become good citizens and fit back in the society that kicked them out, that's actually a shameful experience. It looks successful, and some attained it. Maybe 60% don't even attain that. But we got about a 40% success rate on average. And I knew that at some level they still are going to feel the shame. They're going to feel ashamed that they had to go through this program to actually get back to the society that kicked them out in the first place and shame them as part of that. They were in shame before they got kicked out. And then when they got kicked out, it was just a more shame on top of more shame. And then they have more shame on top of that shame because they have to do this rehabilitation program under all this strict regime and be very different than everybody else in the world and their society around them and fit back. And even if they're successful, the shame base doesn't disappear. And that's why I'm arguing shame based is you cannot change a shame based personality core, is the argument. And that's what this book was arguing from the psychiatrist I was reading. And I went, yeah, that's true. You can heal some of the scar tissue around, you can manage it, you can mask it better. And as they say, some people take the strategy when they're shame based to mask so well that they can normie themselves, become a good citizen, right? And everybody goes, yay, yay, you're so successful, you're so cool. And of course, the deeper part of you is like, yeah, I'm only cool because I'm flawed. And now you're celebrating me because I'm flawed. Oh yes, I've overcome my flaw. No, check mark. That doesn't count. It doesn't count to that deep younger self inside who is shame based. Now, if you got what I just said there, please even listen to it again a few times. You will start to understand our views of rehabilitation and virtually any program of rehabilitation from AIA to other kinds of youth behavioral programs, which I searched around, investigated. I've done a little bit of workshops with staff from those programs and everything. I just watched the attitude of the caregivers and the program philosophy, the directors of those programs, and the state, right? The Alberta state or the province or the government who's paying for those programs. They do not think like I just thought for you out loud. And I've not written this down and published it, which is why I'm doing this video, is to kind of kickstart me to get out of my shame. Well, what do I mean get out of the shame? I mean just be able to step into it and go public with it. In other words, take my mask down of being this confident, successful, more or less, educator, theorist, philosopher, whatever I call myself, the labels. But all of that is a lot of masking to be normally not really fully sincere. And what I've learned is people don't want to know the severe. And what I meant is to say is Freudian slip. They don't want to know the severity of the hurt, which is your shame base, which is your pain. One of the deepest, most difficult pains there is in the psyche. You might even say in the soul of an individual that makes them experience they are not right. They are wrong. They are not valued. They are devalued. They are sinful. They are not free. To not be free of your own psychic makeup. See, it's like the structure of the psyche. I like to think about the architecture of the psyche. It's so constructed upon the shame base. As I said, cosmology, society impacts all of that, plus your own genetics and epigenetics from your past, alcoholic abuse, generational or whatever. I have all this. I know this. I know this pattern so well. But why haven't I written about it all these years? I've been writing about everything else in psychology, philosophy, and sociology, and education. Because probably some part of me does not want to admit this, what I'm talking about right now. Does not want to write about it. Even if I know it so well, because at some level it triggers my architecture of self, which is an architecture that is constructed in a design that says you are not good. And below that is you do not deserve to live. And below that is you do not actually exist. Not in comparison to people who are doing well, who are successful. Yes, I'll lower my hand. So, yes, definitely have the psychological, if you will, but a deeply philosophical and existential wound called shame. Shame is just emotional expression. Guilt's the surface of that. And fundamentally, now let's get to my specialty, which is fear. It's all fear based, a fear based core self sense and existence, an architecture of fear at the core of the self structure. And developmentally, I can build, or anyone can build a life upon that core architecture structure, and you have to survive. And you will mask that fear based as best you can. Hopefully, not to see have symptoms come out too much and you not to feel the feelings of that shameful, non existent being self place that feels putrid in a way. That's not even the right word, but it feels toxic. It's not even the right word. But those are close to the expression I'm trying to get to of the shame experiencing. So these young boys, they can never get out of that shame base no matter if they repair themselves. Well, is there something more for them? Yes, there is. There's a good education on shame-based personality, which is a good education on fear-based personality and fear-based society that helps and continues to reinforce a shame and fear-based existence slash self slash life for yourself and others that you care about. So shame based is really fear based, i.e., I won't keep saying both those terms. I'm just going to talk about shame based today. Is a pretty tough place to experience love. There's a lot of experiencing that one could say is love like, but theoretically, I doubt in the architecture of fear, the architecture of shame, that one can actually experience love. And that's not just meant to be sad or something to be treated in a pitiful way. No thanks. Shame-based people are not interested in that. But it's a kind of acknowledgement, I think, that is really accurate and truthful. And yet, as I said, we can improve our education on this dynamic. And I'm starting to try and do that today for you. Maybe you'll find this useful. Maybe you'll do some reading. Maybe you won't find the reading so useful. Maybe you'll find, my way of thinking more useful. Mine is pretty rare. Not too many people are talking like I am and will. But the point being is that the young people that I worked with had this, and we didn't really know how to treat that. I didn't either. I think I may have helped a little in those years, 10 years I was at that ranch between 1983 and 1993. And so I'll end this video now with a reporting on something I found on the internet just the other day. I'm in the process of writing both an autobiography. That's not going all that well. I'm motivated and then I'm not motivated. It's kind of hard to write it, and that could be part of my shame-based personality. I don't want to put my world, my life out there too much, and go through all of the emotional tragedies of my life as well. But a memoir is a little easier, so I said, well, maybe I can write a memoir and have a memories, the thoughts. Well, I had a dream. The short story is I had a dream the other day, and it was about the director of the Quest Ranch program, and he was testing me and putting me through a very rigorous training um, in this outdoor space, and it was physically demanding, emotionally, psychically, spiritually demanding. And I just remember vicious dogs that he had were biting at my toes and feet and my legs, and I had to somehow keep them off. I had to go through the pain without feeling the pain they were actually causing me and the damage. And somehow still I was up for the task. It was kind of like my heroic self, the deviant self, but also the rebel hero self, so called, that is still fighting to struggle against this pattern of non existence, this deep shame. Yeah, the director was out there, and I didn't hate him. I was obviously motivated by his, in a sense, cruelty almost to put me through this, like a sergeant would be, sergeant major in an army training of soldiers. And I was forcing myself to go through it. And as I say, sort of successfully going through it to the degree, to some degree. I don't remember all the details of the dream, but in the end, I kind of woke up, wrote down, and then I started thinking, what happened here? Don Hale is showing up as director. Haven't thought about him a lot. Off and on, I do, for sure. But virtually, 40 years, I haven't seen or heard of him. And I knew where he lived, but I didn't really know. And it's him and his wife that were both co-directors. And I started thinking, well, I bet you he's not alive anymore because he was quite a bit older than I was at the time when I worked for him as this therapeutic manager and artist in residence in a way. And I found a document when I put his name punched up in Google, and it showed up right first, and it was from the Alberta Legal Department doing justice, doing an investigation into a death in the Quest Ranch program in 1994. The investigation went into 1995. The incident was on June 17th, 1994. One of the students slash clients of the program where I worked all those years had hung himself during an on program. Not good. Not good for the boy, not good for all of his connections, not good for history and ancestors, not good for Quest Ranch as being responsible legally for that young boy while the parents and or caregivers had given over responsibility to Quest Ranch for that year. That's what they do. That's the legal contract. That's what I worked under for 10 years. I quit in 1993 after 10 years, resigned. That's a longer story of why I resigned. And then what happened is that 6 months after I had left, and again, you remember, I'm supervising all the young people, as well as the ones that left who are in foster homes and or back with their parents. I'm supervising probably 30, 40 people. That means watching and attending to what's happening in their therapeutic recovery, the rehabilitation, right? The recovery program. Trying to make it go well and keep in touch with it in some way with limited resources we had. But that's my psychic soul spiritual commitment for these young people. 6 months after I had left, the first incident of a youth in that program, and I knew this youth. I worked with him a little bit because as I was leaving, he was just coming in. I can't even remember his name or what he looked like at this point in time. I just heard the story later after I'd left Quest Ranch. Somebody informed me that one of the kids committed suicide on the program, and I went, "Ooh, that's hard." And I didn't investigate it. I was too busy. I had my family, I had my other careers and my other things going, and so I didn't investigate it. And I was no longer, putting my head and heart back into Quest Ranch. I'd kind of left it, so there was a separation going on. But it was always in the back of my mind. Well, here it is. I found it on the computer the other day after having this dream with Don Hale, my director. I look it up, and oh my gosh, I'm reading the report of the suicide investigation, possibly a criminal negligence on the part of Quest Ranch, the very program that I dedicated 10 years to. And I see, exactly now, oh yeah, that boy did this to himself 6 months after I left the program. And I know that the program could not replace me in the depth and skills that I had built in those years of how to work with youth and stay connected to them in their therapeutic journey. We called it the hero's journey at the time. That's what I brought into the program. Joseph Campbell's idea of the hero's journey and this really sensitive psychosocial, mythic, anthropological, philosophical, spiritual, holistic approach to what they were going through, and ultimately attempting to get them out of so being entrapped in the shame-based personality in destructive ways. I'm not going to go into the full report of what happened with this young person, but here's the last note, and that's what this I'm quoting now, this young person's note. He left before he did himself in. Last note. If I am dead when you read this, I'm sorry for having to leave this way. I might not be mad or upset when I kill myself, but I decided a long time ago that I would do it because I won't be anything. End quote. It's that last line that really grabs me. Maybe it grabs you. I knew a long time ago. In fact, he says, I decided a long time ago, but that means he knew even longer ago than that decision. That tells me this goes back way, way into a 14-year-old's life when they felt shame-based. They don't use that language. They don't even understand that language. People around them don't understand that language. There isn't a communication channel for talking about shame. Sadly, very, very, very much missing. And missing in virtually all the things I read. This is lost. This is lost, folks. This is a deep, and maybe humanity has never found it. So maybe it's lost, but in a way it hasn't even been developed. So maybe it's not lost. Maybe it's just not uncovered. And if I can be part of helping uncover this fear-based / shame-based dilemma, pathology, of our entire society for not having the discourse, so this boy could not talk about shame in the way they did. So who could they talk to? when they felt this feeling for the first times. And then at some point they decide who are they talking to when they decided. My guess is they never shared it. They never shared any of that with anybody, including counselors, including me when on maybe the brief amount of time I worked with them. I don't know and I don't remember actually. It's just too long ago that I would do it because I won't be anything. And of course, those last three words, four words, I won't be anything, is exactly my theory I was just giving you earlier, and it's my experience earlier. This is a feeling that is more than an emotion. It is more than a feeling of non-existence. I do not belong here. I don't exist here. And the reason, the pain of it is if I exist here, right? If the psyche accepts it exists here, it's kind of the whole body, psyche, self saying that. And a damaged, hurt, very injured psyche, body, self. Yes. It's saying that I won't be anything because I can't be anything. And anything I can be will only be a fake. It will be me faking what is so called normal self behavior, existence, belief in, faith in, commitment to. I can't buy it because I'm too honest. I'm too sensitive to the honesty. Such a radical honesty at the base of shame base. Maybe that's my thesis for today. Thanks for listening today. This came all out, pretty spontaneously as I just read this the other day. This is a bit raw for me too. Yeah, I feel a lot. But let's have conversation on the comments below if you wish. Check out any of my other videos on YouTube and certainly share these as you will. And I appreciate if you pass them on for sure. Makes my life also feel a little bit more worthwhile. But I'm going to keep doing videos, I guess, till the day I die, and we'll see where they all go. And I'm glad to contribute this one on shame. Look forward to further conversations with you. Bye now.